Can you hear me? Good afternoon. We'd like to welcome you here to our annual Distinguished Lecture. My name is Nicholas Toth. I'm the co-director of the Craft Research Center and the Stone Age Institute, along with Kathy Schick, Treasurer, and Kathy. And this is being co-sponsored by with the Mathers Museum of World Culture. Will the Mathers people please raise their hand? And Jeff Conrad, the director of the Mathers, you raise your hands. Who you may have heard just discovered with his group, Captain Kidd's Pirate Ship, among other things. Very cool. So this is our annual lecture on human origins. It's called the Leighton Wilkie Lecture. You probably don't know who Leighton Wilkie is. He was a modern toolmaker. He invented one of the 7 modern machine tools, basically the metal bandsaw for cutting through metal. But he had a fascination for the evolution of technology. He saw the relationship between the prehistoric past and the present. And he was a mentor to a number of famous anthropologists who looked into the past. He funded a lot of Louis Leakey's research at Olduvai Gorge, Louis and Mary Leakey. He funded Raymond Dart's work in the early 8-man caves in South Africa. He gave Jane Goodall her first money to go to Gombe, Tanzania to study chimpanzees, and she actually named one of the tool-making chimpanzees after him, named Wilkie. And he got us started here at Indiana University as well. He passed away in about 1992, and we wanted to honor his legacy and his support for this discipline, so that's why we have this annual lecture. And most of our lectures involve paleoanthropology and paleoanthropologists studying fossils and stone tools, but this is an unusual one for us that we are focusing on a historian this year. And there's a reason for this. About 2 years ago, Kathy and I were approached by Jack Gill, who's a new trustee of Indiana University. We actually took a course with him in the business school, Kelley Business School in Indianapolis. He said, you guys ought to do a brochure of the most important events in evolution from the Big Bang onwards. And we started developing that, and then we said, this would make a great book project. So we're writing a book, and then we said, this will make a great museum exhibit. So we're working with the Mathers Museum on an exhibit of what we're calling From the Big Bang to the World Wide Web. The 100 most important things you need to know about the origins of the cosmos, the Earth, life, and the human species. And we're doing it in 10 nested timescales. And each one is containing 10 events. And we have a number of consultants from other departments that are involved in that. George looks in history, for example. We have Professor Basu, who will be working with us, who studies meteorites and lunar rocks, and other people. And we went to a conference with some of our colleagues in Hawaii in January. It was called the Evolutionary Epic. And that's where we met David. And we didn't realize there was a core group of historians who have this movement that David has named the Big History, documenting history from the origins of the universe onwards, which will be the subject of this talk today. And we thought this would be a great person to bring in for our annual lecture. David will also be an outside advisor on our exhibit project as well. David was born in Brooklyn, New York, and he spent his early years in Nigeria, and then was sent to school in England, where he attended Oxford University and got his undergraduate and graduate degrees from Oxford. His specialty is Russian history, 19th century Russian history. He has a fascinating book on the role of vodka in Russian history. He just, on the drive here, I never realized this, that the Russian military was funded by vodka sales in the 19th century, for example. And he was a professor of history at Macquarie University for 25 years in Australia. And he has, since 2000, he has taught at San Diego State University, taught big history and other courses in the history department. And I'm happy to report that he has just been offered a professorship to do big history back in Macquarie. So he'll be moving back to Australia in January. And some of you may know he has a series of lectures. He has 48 half-hour lectures on big history that you can purchase on DVD or tape. And one of the people that really was interested in this series was Bill Gates of Microsoft, who contacted David about a month and a half ago and said, I really am fascinated in the way you're presenting this, and I want to fly to San Diego to meet with you. So David spent several hours with Bill Gates in his hotel room in San Diego to talk about big history as a concept, and how one can use this as a teaching tool. So without further ado, let me introduce David Christian to give our keynote lecture this year on Maps of Time, an introduction to big history.
Thank you for a very generous introduction, and I am truly honored to be invited here and slightly daunted at being a historian talking to and with paleontologists, scientists of various kinds. But I hope you'll get a sense of why I feel this is worth doing. This lecture, I'm trying to wean myself off PowerPoint. So this lecture is going to be some PowerPoint, but some non-PowerPoint. So let's go into a non-PowerPoint bit. So I hope this is not too messy moving back and forth. Let me begin with the definition of what I understand by big history. I think of big history as the attempt at a coherent account of the past at all scales. I see it as something that can help us place humanity within the larger story of the biosphere and, in fact, of the cosmos. And in fact, in many ways, I see big history as a scientific equivalent. That is to say, a story using modern scientific data of traditional creation stories. And the project I think of is driven by what E.O. Wilson described in his book Consilience as the Ionian enchantment. In other words, a deep commitment that there is an underlying unity to science and knowledge, and our job is not just to see the bits and pieces of knowledge, but to try to see that larger unity. So that's the commitment. Straight away, I'd like to apologize for the label, Big History. It's, I'm sure you can think of all sorts of reasons why it's not the ideal label. It's inflated, so let me explain why it's there and why I'm still using it. I was asked when I started teaching Big History in 1989 at Macquarie, very naively. I'll talk briefly about how I started. And I was asked to write a journal article about this course. It quite quickly acquired some notoriety, a course that begins with the origins of the universe and ends now. And I had to come up with a label because I couldn't keep referring to the course that begins with the origins of the universe and ends now. So I thought of Big History on the analogy of the Big Bang. It was cute, it was kind of catchy. In retrospect, I'm not sure it was the best label at all, but it sort of caught on, it sort of stuck. So that's why I'm staying with it. I'm hoping it'll just become a neutral label for this project. Big History is the idea of Big History is actually, I think, in a very curious situation. It's almost completely marginal. I could list people teaching courses in Big History. I'd only need 2 hands, I think, to do it. Now, there may be more courses that are sort of Big History, but it's very marginal. It's marginal as a research project. No one knows what it would mean as a research project yet. It's marginal as a teaching project. I hope that'll change very quickly, and I am personally convinced that it will. There are very good reasons why it should, but meanwhile, it's extremely marginal. Yet, something like Big History, I believe, has been taught in all human communities that we know of. In other words, whenever humans have tried to think historically, they have always done both the detailed stuff and the big picture. They've always, creation stories seem to tell very, very detailed stories, but also in any cycle of creation stories, at some point, you get an attempt to put it all together. Recently, I gave a talk on prehistory and world history. And I was, sorry, did this just cut out? No. And I've been trying to persuade my colleagues in world history that they need to take prehistory more seriously. And I came across a lovely little phrase, is whenever I turn down, I seem to lose the volume. I came across a lovely little phrase in Middlemarch, which was from the young doctor, Tertius Lydgate. And he does medical experiments. And he says, there must be a systole and a diastole in all inquiry. The systole, just to remind you, is the contraction phase of the heartbeat. The diastole is the expansion phase. And I think this is a very, very nice metaphor for what Big History is trying to do. It's trying to return us to the diastole phase of research. So it's almost completely marginal, and yet I think something like Big History has been dominant in all historical traditions until very recently. Now, I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about my understanding of the history of Big History to try and put it in a larger context, and I've already anticipated some of my conclusions. So the first thing I've already argued is that in some form, I believe that the sort of thinking that lies behind what I call Big History has been present in most human communities. It's certainly present in the creation stories of cultures without literacy. We call these stories somewhat patronizingly creation stories. But as far as we know, every community told something like this, a unified account of origins. Where did the stars come from? Where did the planets come from? Where do the mountains come from? Where do our people come from? Where do those people come from? And so on. They've always tried to answer this. But it's also true in literate traditions. You can find in all literate traditions at least attempts at what is often known in the Western cultural tradition as universal history. Universal histories, self-conscious universal histories, appeared first, as far as we know, in the wake of the conquests of Alexander the Great. And that's perhaps no surprise, because suddenly there was a need to deal with an awareness of a hugely expanded range of different cultures. And in the Mediterranean tradition, in Christian Rome, the idea of a universal history became incorporated within Christian tradition. So Augustine's City of God was an attempt to place the story of humanity, the city of man, within the larger picture of God's story of the universe. And that story became immensely influential, of course, in Christian cosmology and Christian tradition. It was a form of Big History. But something like that can be found in Chinese tradition, in Muslim traditions, in the work of Ibn Khaldun or Al-Tabari, in Mayan cosmologies, I think in all literate traditions. In the Western tradition, something like Big History survived certainly into the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, the idea that knowledge is unified, that you could tell a unified story of the past, is very much present in the Enlightenment. It survives remarkably until quite late in the 19th century. The big system builders, Marx, Hegel, Kant, all took it for granted that one should try and tell a story like this. But remarkably, even Leopold von Ranke, who historians often think of as the pioneer of detailed, sharply focused, archival-based research, towards the end of his life attempted a universal history. He too was deeply committed to the idea that there must be a diastole in historical research, a sense of the totality as well as a systole, a sense of the sharply focused details. Let me quote Ranke on this. Universal history, he wrote, comprehends the past life of mankind, not in its particular relations and trends, but in its fullness and totality. The discipline of universal history differs from specialized research in that universal history, while investigating the particular, never loses sight of the complete whole on which it is working. And he goes on to say that history must never lose sight of this sense of each particular part of history being embedded in a larger whole. That is what ultimately justifies the discipline. So this sense that history must aim at a total story was present even just over a century ago. Then it vanished. And I think something like this happened in a lot of different disciplines. I know the story best in history, but it's as if there was a return to a systolic phase of scholarship. Now, why this happened, I'm not quite sure, but here I'm going to attempt a theory which I think makes a lot of sense of where we are today in a world where knowledge is profoundly fragmented. And this is my hypothesis. In the late 19th century, the growing prestige of science meant that in field after field, scholars became determined to prove the scientific credentials of their field. Now, one consequence of this was that you should reject those parts of your discipline for which you lack good data or good research techniques or good information. Just dump them. Focus on those parts of the discipline where there is good data and where you can say something serious, precise, and rigorous. Now, in the discipline of history, think what this meant. It basically meant dumping prehistory. It meant dumping all attempts to go back to the origins of human history. It meant focusing on those eras of human history that could be dealt with some rigor. Those parts of human history that could be dated, and that meant the bits you could deal with through documents. So history became a discipline that studied the past using written documents. And the result of this process of dropping those areas of knowledge for which there didn't exist good knowledge was that knowledge as a whole, this is the best metaphor I can think of, became like a sort of archipelago, whole areas of which had sort of fallen below sea level. And this, I think, helps explain the sort of fragmentation of knowledge that emerged in the late 19th century. Let me quote Ranke on the logic of dumping prehistory. Ranke, when trying to write a universal history, said, unfortunately, history cannot discuss the origin of society. Forget the Stone Age Institute. That's completely out. No room for it. For the art of writing, he said, which is the basis of historical knowledge, is a comparatively late invention. The province of history is limited by the means at her command, and the historian would be overbold who should venture to unveil the mystery of the primeval world, the relation of mankind to God and nature. This is written in the early 80s, I think. And then in 1898, in a famous textbook written by Langlois and Seigneur, they write, "The historian works with documents. For want of documents, the history of immense periods in the past of humanity is destined to remain forever unknown. For there is no substitute for documents. No documents, no history." Very, very clear indeed. Now, I suspect I know the historiography best, that something like this happened in many fields, but I'll defer to your judgment on that. Now, the result of this was, I think you can find in many fields an awareness that something was lost. The passages I've quoted from Ranke earlier show that he was acutely aware that this kind of methodological Puritanism or rigor involved a loss of something very, very important indeed. It's a bit like, the metaphor that comes to mind is an amputation. It's a bit like an amputation. And amputees, as you know, very often can feel the limb that's been amputated. It's as if historians were sort of dimly aware that something has been lost. But then over time, the loss became familiar, and the sense that history was a field based on documents, and it faded into a kind of foggy past which couldn't be documented, became very familiar indeed. Those historians such as Toynbee or H.G. Wells, who persisted in looking for the large story, became more or less outcasts. H.G. Wells tried to do it in the 1920s. He couldn't. He didn't have the dates or the material to do it. Toynbee, to the end of his life, was convinced that there would be a return to a diastolic phase. There's a nice quote from Toynbee in an interview with Wade Mater. As Wade Mater puts it, Toynbee, in the early 60s, I think, comforted himself with the thought that the days of the microscope historians were probably numbered. They, whether they admitted it or not, had sacrificed all generalizations for patchwork, relative knowledge, and they thought of human experience as incomprehensible chaos. but in the perspective of historiography, he wrote, they were in the minority. And Toynbee, in company with St. Augustine, Polybius, Roger Bacon, and Ibn Khaldun, was sure that he would turn out to be in the majority. Now, I'd like to think that we're on the verge of a new diastolic phase, that Toynbee's going to be cheered in his grave. Here are some reasons for thinking this. In the 20th century, there were some very potent reconnections of islands in this archipelago of knowledge. The most powerful one that I'm aware of is probably Big Bang cosmology, linking fields that were thought to be completely separate, the study of the very large-scale astronomy and nuclear physics, into a very, very powerful synthesis. But there have been many other syntheses like this, particularly in the sciences. I think the discovery of DNA allowed a linking of biology and biochemistry that was much more powerful than any linking that had happened before. For the historian, though, I think perhaps the crucial change is what I've been calling in recent work the chronometric revolution. So let me explain what I mean by that. Before the mid-20th century, if you wanted to construct a timeline of the past, you wanted absolute dates, there was one way of doing it, and that was with written documents. Geologists got better and better at sort of guessing at relative dates, but the only way, it's often forgotten how recent this is, the only way you could get absolute dates was through written documents. Now that already meant you could not construct a rigorous, reliable, plausible timeline for the past further back than about 3,000 years. And that already was a severe limitation on history. Then in the 1950s, radiometric dating techniques kicked in, beginning with carbon-14, but then a whole range of new technologies and other non-radiometric dating techniques. Now, what these did was, I think, to revolutionize the possibilities of historical thinking. Now, if I'm right, this is a revolution that historians have not yet fully taken on board. But what it means is that we could now come up with rigorous timelines going back 13 billion years. And those timelines are getting better and better. And they're a product of the last 50 years. Let me quote Colin Renfrew on the implications of what I've called the chronometric revolution. He writes, "The second half of the 20th century saw major changes in the nature of prehistory. The development of radiometric dating methods, including radiocarbon, allowed the construction of a chronology for prehistory in every part of the world. It was, moreover, a chronology free of any assumptions about cultural developments or relationships. And it could be applied as well to non-literate societies as to those with written records. To be prehistoric no longer meant to be ahistoric in a chronological sense." And he goes on, "As a consequence, a new kind of world history, prehistory, became possible. It was feasible to date quite independently of one another all the ancient civilizations of the world. It became possible at last to date the fossils documenting the various stages of human evolution and their accompanying artifacts." This is a profound revolution in the possibilities of thinking about the past. And what it means is that we can now think about the past at all scales, and we can date that past with some rigor. So the reasons for dropping the remote past and for creating this archipelago of subjects, many of them have fallen away. And that, I think, is one of the most powerful reasons for thinking that we may be on the verge of a new diastolic phase, and that big history is part of that. Now we have a single chronology going back 13 million years. Now, okay, to give you a slight break, let's look at some of these dates. What I'm going to do is put up just 11 dates for big history, for those of you who may not yet have a sense of how this timeline can frame this very large story. So here are 11 dates. The universe appeared 13.7 billion years ago. Teaching this course over 20 years, I've watched this date get more and more precise. When I began, I was teaching students that the universe began somewhere between 10 and 20 billion years ago. Now we can say 13.7 billion years ago. The Earth was created 4.5 billion years ago. The first living organisms appeared about 3.8 billion years ago, which is remarkably quick. That's one of the most interesting parts of this timeline. The first multicelled organisms appeared late. And again, when I show this timeline to students, they're often shocked at how late this is. The dinosaurs were wiped out. I have to talk about dinosaurs, but of course it's immensely significant because if they hadn't been wiped out, we would not be here as part of a sort of mammalian radiation in the last 67 million years. The first hominines about, I think probably I should say 6 million years. Our species, somewhere between 200,000 and maybe 60 or 70,000 years ago. The first agricultural societies 10,000 years ago. The first civilizations and written documents about 5,000 years ago. And that, of course, was when conventional history normally begins. And most world history courses still essentially start about 5,000 years ago. The Industrial Revolution and humans enter space just 50 years ago. Now, if you're not familiar with this, then it's hard to get a sense of proportion. So let me run this timeline past you again in a slightly different form. Here what we do is we imagine that the whole of time is collapsed by a factor of 1 billion, so that the universe was created 13 years ago. Now, because we can grasp 13 years, it's much easier on this scale to get a sense of proportion. So let's do it again. So the Earth existed, the universe was created 13 years ago. The Earth existed for about 5 years. Large organisms with many cells appeared about 7 months ago. The asteroid that killed the dinosaurs landed about 3 weeks ago. Hominines would have existed for 3 days. That's the Stone Age Institute, 3 days. Our own species, Homo sapiens, for about 53 minutes. I have to say, this timeline, when I first show it to students, is a very powerful document. It's a very powerful way of encapsulating some of the payoffs to this large story. Agricultural societies, this is where world history normally begins, would have existed for 5 minutes. The entire recorded history of civilization for about 3 minutes. Modern industrial societies for about 6 seconds. So that is a sort of extremely simple framework that arises out of the new dating techniques available as a result of the chronometric revolution. Now, if we have this story, is there any unity to it? Let's grant that we can now tell a story that a century ago we couldn't have told. We can tell a coherent account of the past going back 13 billion years. Now, immediately the question arises, because knowledge is so balkanized today, can there be any coherence in such a story? And I'd like to argue that the answer is yes. I know there's a narrative coherence because I've been teaching this for 20 years. It's a story that hangs together. But that's a sort of literary comment. Is there a deeper scientific coherence to it? Well, one of the forms of coherence that I think is becoming clear is a central theme. And the central theme is that of complexity. Now, I'm sure there are other themes to be found, but this at the moment looks like one of the most potent ones. And I say this not just out of my own teaching. Eric Chaisson, an astronomer who's been teaching an astronomer's version of Big History for some 25 years in Boston, is the person who's been arguing this most forcefully. The argument is basically this. The universe began in a state of considerable simplicity. Over 13 billion years, it's not that the universe on average has got more complicated, but more complex things have appeared one by one. And this is a sort of ratcheting up process. Complex things allow more complex things, which allow more complex things. Now that, it seems to me, provides a very powerful through line for this story. Not necessarily the only one, but it's a very powerful one. Chaisson argues that, and I'll put up a slide that shows this. Okay, Uh, Let me backtrack slightly and let me offer just a quick and dirty definition of complexity. Complex things, we can say, have, first, multiple components. They're made of lots of bits. Secondly, those components are linked together, and they're linked together in precise ways. There are also new energy flows holding these complex things together. There is lots of energy. There are new emergent properties. Now, the idea of emergence becomes critical in this story. And very briefly, this is how I interpret the idea of emergence. You take components, you put them together in a precisely specified pattern. DNA specifies the pattern for each of us as an individual. And what you find is entirely new properties, and those properties often have a sort of magical quality to them. And the reason they have this magical quality is because you cannot find them in any of the components from which a thing is formed. They arise from the pattern, not from the components. That's why they cannot be reduced to the components. So each level of complexity has new emergent properties. Living organisms have properties that non-living chemicals don't have. And I'll argue later that human history has emergent properties that the biological realm does not have. And finally, death. All complex things finally break down and vanish. Now, you can see complexity at many scales. I like this picture. It's just a visual illustration. Figure 1, the brain tissue of a cat. Figure 2, supercomputer simulation of a clustering of galaxies. So complexity can appear in the universe at many, many different scales. And there is a hierarchy. There's good reason to think that complexity builds on complexity. So we can think of a hierarchy, and this is Richard Dawkins talking about this hierarchy in the biological realm, that the hierarchy ranges from fundamental particles up through molecules and crystals to the macroscopic chunks which our unaided sense organs are built to appreciate. Living matter introduces a whole new set of rungs to the ladder of complexity. Macromolecules folding themselves into their tertiary forms, intracellular membranes and organelles, cells, tissues, organs, organisms, population communities, and ecosystems. Eric Chaisson, the astronomer I mentioned before, has gone slightly further and suggested you may be able to quantify rising complexity. Now, this is a controversial idea, but it's an interesting one. And he argues you can do it by estimating what he calls the free energy rate density, the flow of energy through these structures. Now, I mention this point because this is going to become very relevant to human history. And here are his sort of back-of-the-envelope calculations. I don't think he'd claim anything more for them than that. And what you see immediately is that modern human society, on these calculations, looks as if it represents an extraordinarily high level of complexity. And that's one of Chaisson's main points. And I think it's a conclusion immensely relevant for historians. Here are the same information in graphic form, so you can see that. So here's this sense of a hierarchy of complexity. We don't need to try to be over-precise about this. Now, if this is true, then we can tell this story as a story of the appearance of new entities, new levels of complexity with new emergent properties. And very crudely, in the course I teach, I pick 8 thresholds. Now, one could do this in many different ways. Each threshold represents a new level of complexity. So the first is the universe. The second is the first galaxies and stars. Stars, the first complex structures of this kind. Then new chemical elements created in stars and supernovae, planets and our Earth, life, then human beings. And because I'm a historian, humans get 3 thresholds. So they get a threshold when they arrive. I deal with humans. They get a threshold when agriculture appears, and they get a threshold at about the Industrial Revolution. One could, change this. But this sense of a series of thresholds with new emergent properties is very important. It also helps us define different disciplines, because I hope it's clear just from this table that what different disciplines do is to deal with the different emergent properties of different features of this story. That's one way of defining them. Okay. Now, that's to argue that there is a unity in this story. Now, what I'd like to do now, and this is really the last part of the lecture, is to talk about, how can I put it, why big history is a good thing. I've already suggested some reasons, but I'd like to develop them slightly further. Why I think telling this story, researching this story, teaching this story has immense potential today. Now, I'm going to do this by talking about three agendas that we can see lurking behind this story. The first is a research agenda. This story implies a whole series of interdisciplinary research agendas. Secondly, there's a teaching agenda. And I'll argue that teaching this story in schools and universities itself could be a very, very powerful device. And it could be taught at many levels of sophistication, beginning literally in kindergarten. My wife is a professional storyteller. She used to tell this story in half an hour because I bragged to her once that I was going to tell this story in 13 weeks at university. She said, I'll do it in half an hour. And she did indeed. And she did that in schools in Sydney for several years. The third agenda, I'm not sure if I could call it a political agenda, but that's what I'm going to call it for the moment. This story, I think, is a powerful way of moving towards a sense of global citizenship. So let me go through each of these agendas, and then I'm done. First, the research agenda. And this takes me back to E.O. Wilson's arguments about consilience. Now, E.O. Wilson has been deeply committed for a long time to finding unity across disciplines, and also to the idea that the crucial area where we have to find unity is between the humanities and the sciences. That, he argues, is the biggest gulf of all in this archipelago of knowledge. And bridging that gap, he argues, has the potential to generate a huge intellectual synergy. And when I say that, I'm thinking of the sort of synergy generated by Big Bang cosmology in the middle of the 20th century. This is a way, he argues, of breaking down the gulf between the two cultures that C.P. Snow talked about, which is still very much alive and with us. And his argument essentially is that if we can do this well, there's a huge intellectual synergy waiting out there. Now, E.O. Wilson's early attempts to do this generated huge hostility within the humanities, and I think there were good reasons for that. I think it was crude, and I think it can be done better. And I'm going to suggest some ways I think we may be able to make this segue from the biological realm to the human realm. So let me take this as an illustration of the sort of research agendas that I suspect could be built on this story. Looking at the segue from the biological realm to the realm of human history. Now, the first thing to be said, I think, is there are a lot of different fields touching on parts of this relationship. Each of them tends to tackle it in its own way, so at the moment it's still rather difficult to get a clear overview of how you can move from biology to history. This is something I had to do, of course, as a teaching exercise in my course, which is why I've been so concerned with trying to think it through. Now, the first thing to say is there is now, I think, a very broad consensus that it's reasonable to describe this transition as a transition from the Darwinian realm to the realm of cultural change. I was again going to quote Renfrew on this, but I'll just leave that standing. I think there's a very broad consensus that this is a good first approximation to describing what happens when you move from biology to human history, and why it is appropriate that these realms be studied by different disciplines. Secondly, I think there's very powerful reason for thinking that there is indeed a significant threshold at this point in the big history story, a very significant threshold. In other words, there is a real change of some kind. Now, here I've got a few slides to illustrate this point, but again, I suspect it's a point that many people are familiar with. This is just from a recent survey of literature in several fields trying to pin down what it is that's different about humanity and human history. And Michael Gazzaniga writes, although we're made up of the same chemicals with the same physiological reactions, we are very different from other animals. Just as gases can become liquids, which can become solids, phase shifts occur in evolution, shifts so large in their implications that it becomes almost impossible to think of them as having the same components. And I want to argue we really are dealing with such a shift when we talk about the move from the biological realm to the human realm. There are new emergent properties. Now, here's a map that will be very familiar to many of you. It's a map of the migrations of the Paleolithic era. But that map needs to be seen as pointing to what I think is one of the best ways of defining what makes our species different, and that is our capacity to constantly explore new niches, to find new resources in new ways. And it goes back to the Paleolithic. It's not just a modern story. So here we are. Here's the chimp range. Now, contrasting our history with chimps is helpful because we have no good evidence that the chimp range has changed in radical ways in the last 100,000 years. Chimps are doing what most animals do. They have a niche, they explore it very intelligently. There are variations from different groups, but no fundamental long-term change. Now, let's say humans evolved somewhere here about 100,000 years ago. Then this is the story of the Paleolithic, a spread into different parts of Africa. Eventually, there were humans in the Middle East 100,000 years ago, but that migration seems to have gone nowhere. It now seems clear that the real migrations begin 60,000 years ago. And then a series of migrations to the rest of the world. And this story, I'm sure, is very familiar, but the crucial point is that each migration involved technological innovation. You need to find how to work new niches. And that's particularly true, of course, of this migration to Australia, entirely new biota and flora, and this migration here, and this migration into Ice Age Siberia. These were amazing technological achievements. So here we have a species that is showing, even in the Paleolithic, a constant capacity to adapt to new niches, to new environments. And by the end of the Paleolithic, this is the only large mammal species that's not a bird that can be found on all continents apart from Antarctica. And that's the recent end of that story. The result, of course, if you have a species that can constantly find new ways of extracting energy from its environment, apart from the fact that this allows the sort of buildup of complexity that Jason talked about, is populations are going to grow. And again, this is a graph, it's a silly graph in some ways, but if I made it geometric, it'd be harder to read. Look at that spike at the end. That is quite astonishing. But what one needs to understand and cannot see is that there actually is a long, slow build-up and then a faster build-up here. So what we see is a process of continually finding new technologies, extracting more resources from the environment, with two gear shifts. One is 10,000 years ago. Where are we? Here. And the other is about here with the Industrial Revolution. This is associated with an increase in per capita energy consumption. And again, I don't think I need to work terribly hard to persuade you of this. The increase is most striking recently, but it's a story that goes back to the earliest phases of our species, by which I mean Homo sapiens. Now, this is one way of making the point. It's a crude way of making the point. But compare chimp energy use over 100,000 years with human energy use, okay? That's the chimp graph. And of course, I made it up on the assumption that chimps use enough to support themselves with a little left over, and we have no evidence of change. If there had been long-term change, it would surely have shown up in the archaeological record, as it does for our species. So this is the equivalent graph for our species of energy use. The unit there is 1,000 calories per person per day. In the last 10,000 years, our species has multiplied by about 1,000 times. the amount of energy consumed per capita by about 60 times. So that gives you a very rough ratio of an increase of 60,000 times in the resources our species is consuming. And finally, more complexity, more energy being consumed by one species, of course, means less for other species. So this is directly related to the very rapid rate of extinction that's going on today. Now, the crucial point I want to make from these slides is simply that here is a way of defining what makes us different. We continuously innovate. We innovate at a speed that is completely different from that of Darwinian evolution. Now, if this defines us, then we're left with the question of why. Can we explain it? I believe we're very close to a good way of describing it, and this is my attempt to summarize what makes our species different, why we're different, and therefore what human history is really about. And I'm going to use the phrase collective learning. So this is the argument that our species continuously innovates, continuously finds new ways of extracting resources because of its capacity for collective learning. By collective learning, I simply mean that if you have a species which can not merely communicate, but communicate in great volume and with great precision and in great speed, then you have a learning species in which the learning of individuals is not lost each generation, but accumulates within the community. Now, let me be very precise about this, because of course many other species are cultural, many other species communicate. I think the way of defining the threshold is this. In communication systems, a lot is communicated, but a lot is lost as well. With our acquisition of symbolic language, we crossed a threshold at which, and the way I think to define the threshold is, there's a point at which our linguistic ability becomes so good that more information accumulates within the community than is lost. At that point, you get, for the first time, an accumulation, a process of accumulation, a buildup of knowledge from generation to generation within each community. It's rather like, to explain this to my students, I say it's rather like the difference between standalone and networked computers. Chimps are very clever. We can grant that they're as clever as we are, if you like, but they're not networked in the way we are. Most of my students say, what's a non-networked computer? They can't remember those days. So this is a very simple way of describing what I think is the critical difference. Our capacity for symbolic language allows us to accumulate knowledge in a way that no other species can do. That's what we mean when we talk about the transition from a Darwinian realm of natural selection to a cultural realm of human history. And if I'm right, then human history as a discipline is the study of the one species capable of collective learning. Collective learning is a new adaptive mechanism, more rapid and in some ways more powerful than natural selection. It exists on top of natural selection. It explains the buildup of energy control and the astonishing complexity of modern human societies. Now, all of that is by way of an illustration of, I think, the sort of research agendas that big history may throw up, and with luck, they'll be pursued with much more rigor than I can attempt here. Now, two more points I want to make briefly. I've lost track of time, I'm afraid, but I'm nearly there. That's to talk about big history as a potential research agenda. It's also, I think, a very powerful potential teaching agenda. And this is something I'm most familiar with because I've been teaching it. It's a wonderful way of allowing students to ask all the naive questions that I think drove creation stories in the past. Who am I? What is my community? Where did I come from? Where did the earth come from? Where did the stars come from? Where did the sun come from? And of building those answers into a coherent story. This is very powerful stuff for students. And as I've said, I think the story can be taught at many levels, at a very simple, at a kindergarten level, at a primary school level, at a high school level, at a research institute level. It is a sort of modern creation story. It has potentially all the educational power of a creation story. It involves returning to the sort of unified education that I've argued earlier existed before the balkanization of knowledge in the late 19th century. I used to say to my students in Australia, imagine you were learning history 500 years ago. And at that point, I have to take a beat so they realize what I'm talking about. There's a sense in which they would have been better taught than they're taught today, because they'd be told a coherent story which would help them understand their place in the universe. So this is a very powerful teaching syllabus. I've been working on designing a syllabus, which I call the Origins syllabus. It would be a high school syllabus. It would lead you from elementary physics, cosmology, to chemistry, to astronomy, to earth sciences, to biology, eventually to human history. And it would do so in a coherent way, so that students would come away with a sense that there is a unified past. Now, the idea of implementing such a syllabus in high schools at the moment, I suspect, is completely utopian. But I'm going to plug away at it nevertheless, and hope that eventually we may find a way of doing that. Finally, the political agenda. One of the ideas that increasingly intrigues me about big history is that the history discipline was shaped to a degree that I suspect most non-historians may not be aware of by nationalism in the late 18th and 19th century. My guess is that the loss of unity that Ranke was aware of was partly replaced by what I think is a sort of phony unity around the idea of the nation state. And so history became the discipline that taught you your history as an American or a Russian or an Australian or a Serb or a Croat. It taught a series of tribal histories. H.G. Wells was acutely aware of this, and that's why he tried to write the outline of history immediately after World War I. He felt there was a growing need for a history of humanity. So here's the question. Is it possible to construct a history of humanity that can generate the sort of emotional charge that the great national histories generated in their time? I'm not sure of the answer, but what I'm absolutely convinced of is that in a world with nuclear weapons and global problems that have to be solved globally, an awareness of a global identity, of a human identity, is going to be immensely necessary in the future. Can historians make the adjustment? It won't be easy because, of course, governments won't fund it in the way they funded national histories. And it's often been argued to me that the national histories were easy to construct because each of them was built on the anvil of a sort of national enmity. So who's the enemy of humanity? One sighting of an alien would be worth a huge amount to me. If someone could sight an alien, we could bomb the alien to smithereens. That would solve all my problems. But I hope we don't have to do that. And I'm hoping maybe problems such as global warming will act as a surrogate for enmity. But the point I want to end with is this. If we want to construct a sense that there's a coherent history of humanity, in fact, that the history of humanity is a more coherent and rigorous unity than other national histories, big history is the way to do it. If you look at the past on the scales of big history, then you move back down the scales to human history, then the idea of a coherent history of humanity becomes simple, natural, and logical. If you do what most historians try to do, which is move up the scale from the existing national histories towards world history and so on, what you see first of all is the divisions, and the unity seems and feels slightly artificial. So this is my final argument. There is implicit here a political agenda, which is the agenda of a style of history, a way of understanding the past that makes it easier to see the fundamental unity of human beings as a species. Thank you very much indeed.
We'll get to the questions in just one moment, but we have a tradition that we do. We have our annual, Henry Brenda, would you join us on stage? And Jeff Conrad? Okay, why doesn't everybody come out? How about me? introduce two of our good friends, Henry and Brenda Corning from California. Henry is the head of our board of the Stone Age Institute. And Jeff Conrad, as you know, is the director of the Knowledge Museum.
On behalf of the Stone Age Institute and the Craft Research Center at the University of Modern Museum, we would like to present you with our 2008 award for outstanding research. And we're giving it for your dynamic synthesis of big history, documenting the cosmic, organic, and human evolution.
Thank you, sir. And I'm extremely honored and extremely grateful. Thank you very much indeed.
Now we'll turn the lights up, but I think we'll have a roving microphone as well.
Okay, I intended to switch on my watch and keep track of time. I'm afraid I lost track, so I'm really hoping I didn't go horribly over my time limit. But I'm very happy to take questions on any aspect of this. Yes?
Are you familiar with Teilhard de Chardin's writings?
I know of. I'm not terribly familiar with the Chardin.
Essentially, was a similar theory of evolution on the physical, biological, and cognitive level.
Yeah. I've often thought I should go. I mean, one of the problems with big history, of course, is I ought to be reading so much stuff. So the great danger is you're skating on the surface. And I've been wanting to go back and read Teilhard. I read him as a child and didn't really understand him. But I think I take work like that, and of course you can find all sorts of people who, in this world of balkanized knowledge of the 20th century, were actually looking for this larger unity. And Teilhard certainly counts as one of them. One of the things I may not have emphasized enough is I've got a feeling, and again, this would have to be confirmed by someone who knows the history of the science much better than I do, that project was bound to be a bit overambitious, as Ranke said, until the late 20th century. When Big Bang cosmology kicks in, we find DNA, so we get a new biological synthesis. We have radiometric dating. So this story can be told with a rigor that was simply impossible in the early 20th century. That's one of the reasons why I suspect big history is doable now. Doable rigorously and in an old-fashioned sense scientifically, in a sense that it probably wasn't in Teilhard's day. Yes?
What the connection between the imminent threat of exhausting the balanced consumption of resources and the presence of the species, the safety of the species? I wonder to what extent the creation of the alien is connected to rediscovering ourselves as needing a better story about how we fit in. Religious organization creates the alien very deftly by distinguishing between us and them in our own social groups. But does that work anymore?
Okay, let me go back a bit. I've found it's very powerful teaching students a story in which they can see a sort of overall trajectory of human history. That itself provides powerful raw material for them to think about what it means to be human. Now, something I didn't say in my lecture is that I'm very keen when I teach it to try and separate the sense of a human trajectory, which can be defined, I think, as, above all, as increasing control of resources at accelerating rates, from the issue of progress. So my students are often seeing this as a story of progress. It's not hard to persuade them that you need to separate the two. Marshall Salin's wonderful article, it's outdated in many ways, but on the original affluent society is a wonderful corrective to that. So by the end of the course, I hope they have a very clear sense that this astonishing power we have to gouge resources out of the environment is not necessarily admirable. It may be dangerous. It may be something that defines us as a dangerous species. And that, I think, provides them with very powerful raw material for thinking about where we're going. And one more quick thing. When I first started teaching this course, I remember a student coming up to me after the last lecture, which I taught 13 billion years, and I ended in the present moment. And this student said, loved the course, but I feel like slitting my wrists. Because I was telling a sort of ecological story of the late 20th century, which was scary. She found really scary. And she said, I don't think you can leave us on a ledge like this in this course. I think you have to talk about the future. So one of the very interesting things about this as a teaching story, as a teaching project, is that the momentum of 13 billion years is such that you have to talk about the future. And that for students is immensely interesting because it's saying, okay, where is this story going? And you're saying it to them in an environment where they understand that in some sense, they may have ownership over where this story is going. So I think it's a powerful story for helping them make sense of all these questions around the fate of humanity and of course the biosphere. Given this way of telling it, I don't need to remind them again that it's about our relationship to the biosphere. So all of these ecological issues come onto an agenda very, very quickly indeed. And that leaves them, I think, in a good position to be figuring out for themselves where the story is going to go next. I don't know if that's quite answered your question, but yes.
I don't know whether I can say this quickly, but I see a feature you might call resonance in this as you go forward. As we look back at the religious creation stories from, say, the three central ones that we're most familiar with here, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, they have a determinative quality, that everything's descending from a point in a determinative way. Whereas the story you're telling, the reconstruction of this, is one that builds in a certain degree of freedom. That there's a character of our species' capacity to alter.
Yeah.
Even though death comes, the release of falls back in, things drop out, things don't work out. There's still this learning community that humans are. And that moves you out of that determinative realm that religion is stuck in. Does that make sense?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I didn't quite catch the last part.
That determinative block that religion seems to get stuck in. When you really create a kind of new religious story, or one that has universal quality and appeal to the scientific world, how can we have a creation story?
Is this a new version of these old stories? Of these old religious stories?
Yes.
I'm sure there's a nuance there I'm missing, but let me have a shot. I've argued, I find the most helpful way of thinking about this, as I said earlier, is to think of it as a creation story, as fulfilling the needs, and I think they're very potent needs that all creation stories fill, because they gave you a sense of identity and they gave a community a sense of identity. These are very, very potent stories. And in fact, I think the absence of such a story in modern education may be one of the reasons why students will look for unified stories elsewhere, outside of modern education. So I'm keen to argue that this can usefully be described as a modern creation story. I have to hedge that about a bit by saying that this is a way of encouraging students to treat creation stories in general with respect. They were based on the best available information, and they fulfilled this powerful story. But it's also a way of trying to get them out of a sort of situation of relativism that many of them are in, and saying, but if you live in the 21st century, this is the story, this is the creation story you need to take seriously. And so the defining feature, I think, is that it's a creation story, well, two defining features. First, it's global. It's the first global creation stories. All the bits and pieces can be tested on a global scale. They can be tested, the scientific parts can be tested in laboratories all around the world. The humanities parts are still probably more tribal. But the second distinctive feature is that it's scientific. And that means that it prefers to do without the hypothesis of a conscious force driving the whole process, and it is open to constant revision as a result of scientific method. But anyway, the payoff is that, yes, essentially it's a creation story, but it's the creation story you need to know if you live in the 21st century. That's one of my attempts to describe it. I also believe that this might mean that it ends up fulfilling many of the roles that certainly organized religion played in the past. Yeah, but I'm reluctant. I also want to draw lines between this story and the religious stories.
One final thing I'd say on that, just to see what it produces. The religious stories are teleological, they point to some purpose of that derives from some conscious being, or that tends to be the way in which we interpret them. Yours does too, but in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
It's in the mincemeat.
It's what?
It's in the mincemeat. It's in the stuff.
Yeah.
All these potentialities in here.
Yeah.
And the long, slow 13 steps. 13.
I'm very reluctant to work too hard at teasing out what I think is the meaning of this story. I'm convinced the story is saturated with meaning. And one simple form of meaning that becomes very, very clear is if you show students this timeline, and you also try to work at giving them a sense of the scale of the universe, their first reaction is, oh my God, we're completely and utterly insignificant. They can fall into a sort of nihilism very, very quickly. And I think in many ways that's not a bad first reaction. But the way I teach the course now suggests a second point, which is that we're astonishingly complex. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but it is an interesting thing. And that leads very naturally to questions which students are fascinated in. Is it likely that creatures like us, capable, as I've defined it, of collective learning, are out there? Are there many like us? So this movement from a sense of nihilism, complete meaninglessness, to a sense actually maybe some sort of meaning resides in complexity is powerful at the teaching level. I'm also convinced that if this story became more familiar, that it were taught more widely, lots of meanings would be teased out of it. There are very practical ones about our relationship with the biosphere and so on, but I'm reluctant to try and push meanings onto it. Yes?
I think both of these, I'm not sure this works, so I'll talk loud if it doesn't work. I think some of these questions illustrate where a less responsible person teaching this course could invite all sorts of conflict, pseudoscience, superstition, etc. Teilhard de Chardin's story says that atoms have consciousness. Okay, so he gets some kind of unification and rising complexity, but I know of no good scientific reason for saying that.
Yeah.
By saying it's an alternative creation story, you're suggesting that it fulfills some of the functions that traditional creation stories fulfilled. And we know a lot of those were in-group versus out-group, a lot of rejection of scientific understanding of the universe and so forth. So I think by calling it a creation story, by talking a lot about meaning, etc., you're inviting people to import all this baggage that I don't think accrues naturally from your project. I think your project is a great one. I'm wondering who is really equipped to teach it in the classroom. Two problems. Do they have the special expertise, understanding of all these sciences, which you've demonstrated to my satisfaction that you have? But that takes a lot of work. And how will they keep out all of this kind of pseudo-creation, substitute religion, New Age worldwide consciousness throughout the universe? Which I don't think needs encouraging. People will do that anyway.
Yeah. Can I mean, you know, I'm very much aware that these dangers are there. Frankly, I don't think the dangers are greater within a big history context than in the context of standard historical teaching. Now, I taught Russian history for many years. I think, what is the first message someone gets from me when they identify me as the person who teaches the Russian history course? They get a tribal message, that there is a sort of Russianness, a Russian identity of some kind, and whatever I do, that is what I will end up teaching. Now, I think there's the possibility with this story, as I said, of actually at least a partial escape from history as the discipline that teaches you tribal identities, and towards it being a discipline that teaches you larger global identities. So that's one possible answer. The other thing I'd say is that the danger of pseudoscience, yes, it's always there. It's there in any class we teach. I can teach Russian history in an incredibly toxic way if I choose to. It's always there. I don't think that's unique to big history. And in fact, in some ways, I would say that I think it may be that because it's such an unfamiliar field, it's likely that people are going to be more sensitive to the loading, the ideological or religious or spiritual loading that any particular version of world history, of big history contains. I've been beaten up plenty of times by people who've sort of, caught me unwittingly loading this story. So my presentation now is informed in part by an attempt not to do that. But I think that the rules of the game are the rules of science, and science in the broadest sense. I mean, good historical scholarship as well as good scientific scholarship. The same rules apply at the scale of big history. The dangers are absolutely there, but to pretend that this story did not have meaning, I think might be an even more difficult challenge than to pretend that it does have meaning. And it certainly has meaning in the very, very simple sense. I called my book Maps of Time, of a map, the sort of limited meaning that a map has. Where am I? Where am I in space? And what this can do is say, where am I in time, according to the best knowledge available? Now you can go away and think about what that position means, about your identity and so on. But without this map, I think the absence of this map may be more dangerous. I mean, I'm pretty convinced that many of I've slowly learned over the years that some of my sharpest students are creationists. If they have the courage to challenge me, they're deeply committed to finding a unified story. And I very often find that they find the unified story in creation science or some other sort of fundamentalism for the very good reason that they don't find it in universities. And yet the story's there. There is a unified story to be told, I think. I'm not sure I've missed nuances in your question, but I hope that covers some of what you said. Yes?
It strikes me that this is still a linear story, and it's a heroic narrative.
So it's a linear story?
It's a linear story, and it's a heroic narrative. In order to be coherent, does it have to be linear? In other words, could it be cyclical?
Yeah.
In order to be coherent, does it have to be heroic? Could it be anti-heroic or even tragic? And I don't know the answer. That's what comes to mind, so I'd like to know your opinion.
No, I take the point straight away. I'm finding form and shape in this story. I'm trying not to impose too much form and shape on the story. I think the scientific story is at quite a deep level linear. I think the second law of thermodynamics probably gives you a linear story. Now, there are cycles within it, God knows, important cycles. But the story of increasing, well, actually, one way of seeing it as cyclical is in the final lectures, I talk about the future of the universe. And remarkably, we can say some interesting things about that. And that is a tragic story, because if you have this build-up, if you regard complexity as a heroic thing, of course, and that needs to be qualified, you have this build-up of complexity, but it's very, very clear that countless billions of years in the future, all this complexity is eventually going to break down, and you're going to end up with a universe that is incredibly boring and incredibly lacking in complex structures. Now, I know some students, at least, and I include myself, find some rather interesting meaning in that. It suggests that if you choose to live at any particular part of the history of the universe, now may be a rather interesting time to live, if you think complexity is interesting. You said it's a heroic narrative. As I said in response to an earlier question, I'm quite keen to undercut that, and I try to do this very much in my teaching, through the idea of progress and through stressing that complex things die. And in fact, you can take that point slightly further. The more complex a thing is, on Chasson's figures, there's a sort of rough rule of thumb. The more complex it is, the shorter lived it is. That applies not just to us as individuals, but maybe to us as a species. And there's a very dangerous story that I think students need to be thinking about. The possibility that what looks like a sort of level of cleverness that chimps can't match is actually going to turn out to be a disastrous gift, you know, like the oil of Nigeria or something like this. So I take your point very much, but I do work quite hard at undercutting that heroic narrative and suggesting there may be a very paradoxical narrative there, and one that's potentially tragic if you think humanity deserves to survive, which most of my students do, I think. Yes?
David, on the phone a few weeks ago, you mentioned your big interest now in Evo-Devo in biology. And this is, if you don't know, it's evolution and development and the relationship between genes and body structures and other things. In fact, two of the people here on my left, Rudy and Beth Rapp, are two Evo-Devo people who we'll be networking you with this evening, and they're advisors on our project as well. But could you just voice what is your interest in Evo-Devo?
Ignorance. Yeah, I'm afraid, Nick, that's probably about it at the moment. I mean, it looks to me like exactly the sort of area of synergy that I expect to find popping up all over the place as these archipelagos of information slowly connect. And I think scientists have done a much better job than people in the humanities of sort of connecting. And I'm guessing that Evo-Devo sort of fits into this. But this is territory in which, quite frankly, I get a bit lost. I don't understand this territory yet, so it fascinates me. And I suspect it ought to be part of the story, but I'm not quite sure how best to integrate it within the story. Yeah. Sorry, that's a very dusty answer, but it's the most honest one. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yes.
Since we're throwing things at you like that, have you read Daniel Lord Smale's book about deep history of the brain? And
Yes.
Any comments on his weaving of sort of neuroscience into the big picture?
I was delighted to see him arguing very aggressively that there's something wrong about a history profession that doesn't take prehistory seriously. But I'm going to confess that at some point I lost the thread of the argument. And I'm not sure whether I didn't read it closely enough or whether the argument itself ran into the sands. I'm really not quite sure. I actually went back to it recently, trying to get back on top of it. This agenda, the very simple agenda of moving from culture to collective learning that I suggested, I suspect that there is very powerful research in many areas, evolutionary psychology, linguistics, that has a huge bearing on this. And I think he's probably more on top of that literature than I. So at this point, I'm going to do the cowardly thing and retreating to saying, well, I am a historian, not a scientist. Daniel Lord Smale. And it's called Deep History and the Human Brain, something like that. Yeah. It's an interesting book. I mean, it certainly comes out of these same sort of questions. And he contacted me about a year ago. I think he's very interested in the big history agenda. And being at Harvard, you know, has a much taller pulpit from which to preach than I do. Okay. Right. Thank you very much.